Good afternoon and welcome to our Women's History Month program featuring Dr. Melanie Price. My name is Eva Rhodes. I'm the counseling supervisor at Cosumnes River College, and we're all happy to have you here today. I will be hosting the program along with Azaria Kamalo. Azaria is an Umoja Diop Scholar student and instructional assistant. Now please welcome history professor and co-chair of Women's History Month, Diana Reed, to provide opening remarks.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for our keynote speaker event for our Women's History Month 2021 celebration. I'm Diana Reed and I teach history at CRC. I'm also co-chair of the Women's History Month Committee at CRC, along with anthropology professor Anastasia Panagakos. So on behalf of the Women's History Month Committee and the Black History Month Committee at CRC, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you and to Dr. Melanie Price, who will be speaking about the power of Black women to affect political change. Anastasia and I would also like to acknowledge the efforts of all the people who helped make this event happen today. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Price, thank you so much again for being here. My co-hosts, Eva Rhodes, Azaria Kamalo, and Tanya Williams, thank you. And for all the behind the scenes work, thank you to Michael Bittner, Rebecca Withy, Derek Santiago, Jennifer McLean, Andrea Dean, Teresa Aldridge, and the Black History Month Committee. Thank you all so much. So I wanted to just say that we're so excited that Women's History Month is happening this year with all events happening virtually. And let me give a little background about Women's History Month. Each year, the Women's History Month Committee at CRC puts together a calendar of events pertaining to the theme that is selected by the National Women's History Alliance. That organization started in 1980, and one of its first tasks was to successfully lobby Congress to designate March as National Women's History Month. And since then, the National Women's History Alliance has continued to provide information and training in multicultural women's history for educators and community organizations, basically for anyone wanting to expand their understanding of women in US history. This year, the National Women's History Alliance decided to continue with last year's theme of Valiant Women of the Vote, refusing to be silenced. And as you can see, we have included many events on our Women's History Month calendar, some hosted by CRC and 3 virtual events happening throughout the country. Oh, thank you for going to that next slide. So I hope you'll be able to attend many of these events, particularly those hosted by CRC, which I'd like to take a minute to quickly highlight. Okay, on Friday, March 12th at 4 p.m., my colleague in the CRC History Department, Alex Peshkoff, will be hosting a discussion on the documentary Chisholm 72, Unbought and Unbossed. This is about the 1972 presidential campaign for Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to Congress and the first to seek nomination to the highest office in the land. Be sure to watch the film beforehand on your own and then join the discussion at 4. Next week, there are 2 events on Thursday, March 18th. At 10 a.m., RTBF Professor Lauren Wagner and I will be hosting an event where we will watch film depictions of women in times of political activism and discuss how their actions brought about meaningful change. On the afternoon of March 18th at 2 p.m., CRC English Professor and Pride Center Coordinator Jose Alfaro and CRC English Professor Danielle Hurd-Malel will be sharing information about the new Social Justice Studies major at CRC and new classes to be taught next year, Intro to Social Justice Studies and Intro to LGBTQ Studies. On Friday, March 19th at 2:30 p.m., CRC Psychology Professor Naomi Baum and the Cognitive Science Club will watch and discuss the documentary My Love Affair with the Brain, The Life and Science of Dr. Marion Diamond. And finally, on Thursday, March 25th at 3 p.m., anthropology professor Anastasia Panagakos and I will host a discussion about the documentary Without a Whisper, which uncovers the hidden history of the influence Indigenous women had on the beginnings of the women's rights movement in the United States. So lots of great events happening this month in celebration of Women's History Month that we hope you can join. To find the Zoom links for these events, check out the Women's History Month calendar, and they are also all on the campus events calendar on the CRC website. Okay, well, that's it from me. Thank you all so much for being here. And Dr. Price, a big warm welcome and a big thank you to you.
Thank you, Diana, for those remarks. Before we get started, I would like to provide some technical reminders on how this Zoom program will work this afternoon. All attendees will remain muted unless we ask you to unmute your microphone. And at the end of the presentation, we will have time for questions. So please use the chat feature to include any questions you might have for Dr. Price. And don't worry if you get disconnected from Zoom, you'll be able to rejoin the program. And now I will turn things over to Azaria Khumalo.
Hello, everyone. I'm Azaria Khumalo, and I'm a communication studies major at CRC and plan to transfer to Cal State East Bay University. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Melanie Price to you. Melanie Price was recently named inaugural director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for Race and Justice. Dr. Price is an endowed professor of political science at Prairie View A&M University and principal investigator for the African American Studies Initiative, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation. Price is the author of 2 books, The Race Whisperer, Barack Obama and the Political Uses of Race, and Dreaming Blackness, Black Nationalism and African American Public Opinion. Dr. Price completed her BA magna cum laude in geography at Prairie View A&M University and her MA and PhD in political science at the Ohio State University. Price was the 2017 Black History Month lecturer for U.S. Embassy in Germany, where she lectured at universities and community organizations across the country. Professor Price was one of the contributors to Stanley Nelson's documentary, Obama Through the Fire, which aired on BET. She's a regular contributor for the New York Times opinion section and has also done political commentary for MSNBC, CNN, Miss Magazine, Elle Magazine, and National Public Radio. Now presenting Dr. Melanie Price.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen. I can only see Azaria, so I don't know if I am, okay, good. I'm like, I don't know if you can see me. I want to say thank you so much, first of all, to Dr. Tanya Williams, who was the person who connected me with you guys. We have been friends and colleagues for a very long time since we were in graduate school. And so anytime she calls, I am happy to oblige and show up to do whatever it is she asks me to do. My work often comes at the intersection of race and gender. And so the opportunity to speak to you about these wonderful Black women during Black History Month makes me happy. And so let's get started. Why my computer is moving so slow, but the title of my talk today is When Black Women Stand Up, the power of Black women in by Ann Johnson, who's a Prairie View professor, and like me, who also teaches there now. And this is something that she calls the intaglio method, where she prints images on cotton, some of which is just sourced from hobby stores, and some of it is cotton from plantations in the state of Texas. And I just think the way in which she uses that is so awesome. And so now I'm using it as my front cover. So whenever I talk now, I like to start with a discussion. I start now with Elsa Barkley Brown. I'm sorry, y'all. It's a very frazzled day. But I want to start with Elsa Barkley Brown. And I always begin with her because her work has been very influential, but I think it gives us the keys, I think, to understanding Black politics as we know it. And first thing she talks about are the sort of the three things that African Americans did in order to ensure that their freedom dreams came to reality after emancipation. One thing they did was they went around the country reestablishing kinship networks. They went and found their family, and when they couldn't find their families, they created non-traditional families. The next thing was they built institutions for the purpose of strengthening faith and education. That is, they built churches and colleges, even though they were largely illiterate. And the last thing that they did was they established the egalitarian model of politics, where in their public sessions, in their meetings, in their discussions about what was going to happen to African Americans, one of the things that they decided is that everybody had been enslaved, men, women, and children. So men, women, and children would in fact be allowed to participate in the discussion. And when men went to the voting booth to cast their ballot, that they had to understand that they were doing that not because they had the right to, but because other people who had a right were excluded from the process. I also want to say, and I like to say this when I'm talking about race and gender, that when I use the term Black women in this presentation, it is an inclusive term that covers all who identify in some way with the categories of Black and woman. I stand in solidarity with Black women without placing any priority on anatomy. This includes cis and trans, non-binary, femme and not, whether you are a mother or not, poor or rich, formally educated or not. I include all of those people unapologetically in how I organize my political priorities and the things that I do around them. It's a thing that I have started saying, making that position clear. As we think about how Black women organize themselves, we often turn to this quote by Anna Julia Cooper. One, because Anna Julia Cooper just deserves to be quoted as much as possible, but also because I think it has become sort of iconic in the ways that Black women understand their politics, where she says that only the Black woman can say when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence or without suing or special patronage, then and only then the whole Negro race enters with me. But we use this quote so often because it so encapsulates, I think, the lived political experiences of African American women. It's not just that you have to keep reminding people with whom you share identities and homes and communities that you should be heard and included. It's that if you don't remind them, if they ever forget it, then the thing that would save them, the thing that would fix this thing for them, is if they kept in mind the politics of Black women. Because when you fix issues, when you deal with challenges related to African American women, you in fact better the entire society. When we think about Black women's political power, we think about it in characterized in a particular way.
For the it's just the,
we may have had more
nothing
interaction with her. Like I could talk with this person in confidence.
I don't know if I put a.
'cause I don't remember seeing a word count on there.
If you want to.
I did read it, but I could be wrong. Like,
I don't care about word counts. I just want you to.
We're gonna pause so someone can.
You know, I understand they can be helpful. Like some students want to know, like, are you looking for just a couple?
Thank you. So Black women's political activity is often seen as collective. They are viewed as organizers, as coalition builders, as the people who empower other people to figure out what their goals are, what their demands are, what are the things that are important to them. And so we often characterize their activism as collective, as organizers, as coalition builders, and as persistent, as people who are persistent. I don't enjoy the word resilient, but I do like the word persistent. This is important because it helps us then understand how we come to the moment of 2020. When we think about Black women and voting rights, it's important for us to remember that there's often this tendency to focus on the great men who have done all of the work, quote unquote, to get civil rights and voting rights in place. That is because we tend to focus on people who are the spokespeople. We tend to focus on people who have the mic. And oftentimes women are not the ones who have the mic, but they are the ones who are in fact building the bridges between the leadership and community to get the things done that need to get done. And I also like to talk about Voting Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act and civil rights, because really when you think about the 15th Amendment, which gave African American men the right to vote, and you think about the 19th Amendment, which essentially gave white women the right to vote, it's not until 1965 that African American women are explicitly included in legislation that has to do with their ability to vote. Because in fact, both of those other opportunities, they were essentially excluded from. One, because the Constitution didn't allow women to vote. And when women got the right to vote, essentially what happens is African Americans are largely excluded from the political process. And so when you think about Black women's political power, it really is since 1965 that we have been able to see them move through this process.
Dr. Price, just wondering, we're getting some comments in the chat about your slides. They're not moving. So I was wondering.
How about I stop share?
Okay.
And then start again.
Okay.
Because they're actually moving for me, so I don't.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna move it, and I need someone to say, because it's hard to see the chat.
Nothing on the screen yet.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh.
Sorry, I'm like, I can't see or hear what's happening. So it might be something on my end. What I'll do is I'll keep talking while I work on this, right? So one of the things that we know about Black women is Black women participate in the political process. As I heard Melissa Harris Perry say, Black women vote as if their life depended on it, because it does, right? And when we think about African American women, one of the things that we know is that 16 million Black women are eligible to vote, and 67% of them are registered to vote. So 16 million Black women are eligible to vote, and 67% of them vote. Black women made up 17% of the voters who cast ballots in the 2017 US Senate race that elected Doug Jones in Alabama, even though they accounted for less than 14% of the state's population. And so the thing that we know for sure is that African American women outperform their own demographic. They outperform what is expected given their numbers. We also know that they are extremely loyal to the Democratic Party. And if you look at African American women, one of the things that you see is that they vote more than 90% for the Democratic candidate, and that's higher than any other group, any other demographic group that we know. Right. In the last few cycles, there have been a record number of African American women who have been elected to Congress. We have 25 women who are members of the House of Representatives, and 2 non-voting delegates, one of whom, Stacey Plaskett, you saw as the House impeachment manager, and the other one, Eleanor Holmes Norton, represents the District of Columbia. Also in this election cycle, I know you guys in California have heard a lot about this, but we lost a senator, the only Black woman senator, in order to gain a vice president. And so one of the things that is now being talked about is what happens, now that this Black woman is no longer in the Senate, to Black women's representation in that body. The challenge, of course, clearly has been breaking into statewide and national offices. That is, figuring out how Black women can become governors and senators and other forms of executive power that are not just interesting because they are important political positions, but because those are also the positions from which most people run ultimately for president. The thing that I think should also be interesting to you, the thing I think that should also be interesting to you, and is also interesting to me, is that we are heavily focused on these African American women who have been powerful in the 2020 election, but we really should take this back further than that. And one of the places that I think it's important to take it back to is to look at the role of Black women as campaign strategists and campaign staffers in sort of us experiencing the moment that we're in right now. And for that, I turn obviously to people like Donna Brazile, Yolanda Caraway, Leah Daughtry, and Mignon Moore, who call themselves the Colored Girls, right? Who have collectively run campaigns, chaired Democratic conventions, staff party offices, run the Democratic Party, consulted with candidates, vetted candidates. They've done every single role that you can imagine of campaign staffers. But they come out of the Jesse Jackson campaign in the 1980s and out of the fight for the MLK holiday. And what they do after the defeat of Jesse Jackson in 1984 and 1988, in his inability to get the Democratic nomination, is they set about working in the party, and they become crucial members of the Democratic Party. But what they also do is they join the Rules Committee and they join other committees to try to figure out what was the problem. Why was it so hard for Jesse Jackson to get the nomination, and how would it be possible for another African American to get the nomination? And they start to do things that become crucially important in our understanding of Obama and Kamala Harris, and that is they do things like move the South Carolina primary up closer to the beginning. So you have a state with a significant Black population weighing in before everybody else does, in the same way that a significantly white population, New Hampshire, gets to weigh in before everybody does. And so they do things like that. They help to create the idea of superdelegates, and they do all of these things. And it is in essence their policies, along with Ron Brown, I should say, who died when he was the secretary in the Clinton administration, a cabinet member of the Clinton administration, and he died during that period. So along with Ron Brown, these women are single-handedly, I think, responsible for creating the kind of rule environment that leads to the election of President Obama and potentially the election of President Harris. But they're also responsible for paving the way for people like Simone Sanders and Corinne Jean-Pierre and Maya Rupert, who are young African-American women who are doing communication work in campaigns. Maya Rupert was single-handedly made Julian Castro a contender in the 2020 election. And so they have worked to become stalwarts as a part of the political process. And as we start to think about Black women in politics, it's important that we not just focus on the work that they're doing as the head of the ticket, but the things that they're doing in the background as well. The question that has been asked over and over again, and that people kept asking during 2020, really is, can Black women save the Democratic Party from itself? The thing that I think is so interesting is that I've basically been using this exact same slide, and I've left it here in the exact same way since like 2012. Because Black people who study Black women and people who study Black politics have been saying that Black women can help you save yourself if you would just listen. And so back then we were talking about people like Maxine Waters, the Squad, the Democratic women in Alabama. And so sometimes the pictures are different, but there's always something that can go under this slide. So names get taken off, names get added on, but in the end, what we know for sure is that Black women, if we look at the way in which they lead politically, they are people who have been actively engaged in increasing counter narratives against Trump. They have been assaulted, and many of them now have to travel with extra security because of the ways that Trump has pointed to them, particularly to think about the problems with the Democratic Party, right? So it's not just the problems with the Democratic Party, it's that the Squad is a problem, and they all need to go back to whatever country they came from, even though 3 out of the 4 of them were born in the United States, right? Maxine Waters talks about having to reclaim her time. It's something that we start to think about. All of these things, I think, sort of symbolize the ways in which Black women have come into a certain amount of political maturity that has really been happening for at least a decade or more, but we're just starting to really think about it and take it seriously because of what happened, I would argue, in 2018 with Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial race and with Kamala Harris in 2020. I also like to point out love talking about grassroots politics when we talk about Black women. For me, it is often the most optimistic and hopeful space in politics. It is a sign for me of a healthy Black community when we have a healthy grassroots political mobilization game. And we see this and have seen this very clearly in Black Lives Matter and other organizations that really, I would think, fall under a larger sort of Black Lives Matter umbrella of organizations that have emerged as spokespeople against things like police brutality and other things. It's also important, I think, to mention this during Women's History Month and African American History Month, because this is Black Lives Matter as an organization, but lots of these organizations are being led by queer Black women who are coming into the African American community, who are coming into youth-led communities, who are coming into these communities and who are taking ownership of the things that are happening there, and who are trying their best not to repeat the kinds of exclusionary norms that existed in previous civil rights movements. But I also mention them because I think we don't focus enough on the level of political maturity that this organization and other organizations under its umbrella have achieved. I think they are making some of the most important political interventions in the modern era. If it wasn't for BLM activists, particularly women in the BLM in 2016, you wouldn't have heard all of the discussions among Democrats about systemic racism, about structural racism. They wouldn't have had to talk about those things. And that becomes even more intense in 2020, where they're not just asking about structural racism or systemic racism. They're asking candidates to tell me, if you want me to vote for you, what is your opinion on reparations? What is your opinion on the current bail process? What are your opinions on all these things that are drastically impacting the African American community? But more than that, I think their foray into electoral politics is a thing that is under talked about, but is a thing that is crucially important. That one of the things that they have been able to do when they saw, after Trayvon Martin, after Mike Brown, after Tamir Rice, and all these people sort of were losing their lives to police officers, one of the things that they noted was that it wasn't just that these police officers were not being held accountable, it's that the district attorney who we elect to do these things is unwilling to do it. And so what they started to do was to unseat district attorneys, to unseat state prosecutors, to unseat the people whose job it is to bring indictments in the courts when they refuse to do so. And that has drastically changed the face of African American politics at the local level, but it is something that is in turn having a national impact. Think about people like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia. Think about the recent fight in Los Angeles against by BLM LA to unseat Jackie Lacey. These are things that have made the district attorney's seat, which was normally something that people didn't pay a lot of attention to, and the district attorney would just hold that office for 20 years. These have now become contested seats, and that has happened because of the work of BLM and affiliated groups. Also, you'll see a picture of Cori Bush, who is one of the first women elected to Congress, who really comes out of Ferguson activism. It's where she cuts her teeth around the issue related to Mike Brown, but she is now a congresswoman. And I think it's important for us to keep thinking about what happens when they move from the streets into actually in the governing bodies. Now, my favorite story to talk about, my favorite story to think about is Georgia. Georgia is in its entirety the way it came out, the way that it came out, because of Black women. Nobody can argue against that. Nobody in their right mind dares argue against that. Basically, I remember in like the late 2000s, like maybe 2008, 2009, hearing Stacey Abrams talk about how she thought she could turn Georgia blue, and basically people laughed. Basically, people thought it was a joke. People thought it was ridiculous. And instead of trying to convince people, the thing that she did was she set to work trying to see whether or not her plan would actually come into vision. All the people you see here are all women who are either elected officials or involved in sort of grassroots mobilizing in Georgia. You have Latasha Brown from Black Votes Matter. You have Deborah Scott, who works with unions. You have Stacey Abrams, who works with Fair Fight. Inse Ufo, who works with New Georgia Project. And then you have elected officials like Keisha Lance Bottoms and Nikema Williams. And one of the things that they do is, because they do the thing I think that Black women do, which is they start to put together coalitions amongst people of color and progressive whites, rather than trying to do what the Democratic Party had been doing for the last 30 years, which is trying to steal moderate white votes from the Republican Party. Stacey Abrams basically said, you don't need to do that, because if you look at the number of people who are not registered, if we just worked on registering those people, we can fill in the gap between where we are now and victory in Georgia. And so essentially she sets out to register hundreds of thousands of people who had not been registered before and figuring out how to get them invested in the process. And so they did this by building strong coalitions, but they also did this by meeting people where they were. And so they would have food at the polls, like for the special election for Ossoff and Warnock, they were giving away turkeys because it happened over Christmas break, right? Happened over the Christmas period. So they were, giving turkeys away. They have food trucks available. They help people figure out how to get there. They figure out how to help people who have literacy issues, how to deal with that and register to vote. They notify people who have been taken off the rolls that, I don't know if you know this, but your name is no longer on the ballot. We can help you figure out how to get this done. And it's important to think about, because it's important to know that right now, the Georgia legislature is trying to make everything they were doing to get them to this point illegal. You can't, even though we know that Black and brown people spend more time waiting in lines at voting booths, for instance, they're trying to make it illegal for you to offer food to people who are waiting in line to vote. Even though sometimes we know that in Black and brown communities, people wait hours to get through lines, not minutes. And so looking at Georgia, I think, is a way to look at what I think is a more functional and healthy future for the Democratic Party, should it decide to follow that lead. I know other Southern states are trying to recreate the Georgia, I don't even want to call it the Georgia miracle, because that implies that it just happened. It was just happenstance, but try to recreate the results of what happened in Georgia. Vice President Kamala Harris. I'm sure you guys have spent in California more time thinking about this than most people, because she has been in the public eye there for a long time. It's important for us to talk and think about Kamala Harris for several reasons. I think one is that she is sort of a rarity among African-American women who was able to win state office more than once and for more than one position. Right? So there are African-American women who have been attorney generals before, but they haven't been able to parlay that into maybe a Senate run, or they haven't been able to transform that into a gubernatorial run. And Kamala Harris, walking into the 2020 process, already has that part down. So when people start to say, what about electability, which they still question for her and all women, really, there was no woman in the race whose electability wasn't questioned. Even Liz Warren, who spent time as the front runner in that race, but they still question her electability, even though California is probably one of the most important Democratic states, and she was able to win it more than once, which is something that most African Americans were not able to do. I think it's also important to think about the ways in which the question of race and racial solidarity have played out around Kamala Harris, right? And so one of the things I tell my students when we're talking about this is, I'm not asking you to like or dislike Kamala Harris. I'm really asking you to think through what it means for Black women who end up in spaces like this. And so she very much stepped onto the political scene. People used to refer to her before she ran for president as sort of the female Obama. They have a lot of a similar kind of biography. But there's a way in which Barack Obama was allowed to be more fluid in the way that he moved through the Black community, in the ways that he was able to campaign in African American communities that seemed impossible to her. And I don't have an answer for that. I just think it's something that we should spend some time talking about. Of course, as a person who is a Black feminist and who studies race and gender, I'm going to argue that some of that is gendered. Some of that is more difficult for Black women to do some of the things politically that African American men are allowed to do. Also, I think it's important that we all need to think about it, because should Joe Biden not run for a second term, and most people believe that he won't do that, that means that Kamala Harris is the heir apparent for the 2024 nomination. Vice presidents always get first say, or they should always get first say, and it's frowned upon when other members of the party run against a sitting vice president for president, which essentially means that if Joe Biden chooses not to run in I guess 3 years now, then you are looking at the person who will be our presidential candidate. And that is huge, thinking about an African American woman being at the top of the ticket, asking what will media coverage look like? How will they talk about her body language? What kinds of adjectives will they use to describe her? Will they call her angry? Will they call her sassy? Will they call her things that loud, or other things that are often the things that we refer to when we're talking about Black women in the larger public sphere? So I like to think about this as we got now and next, right? It's not just that we have now and the fact that African American women played a crucial role in changing the political map in 2020. I think it's important to talk about the kinds of capacity building that African American women have been able to do in at least the last 2 election cycles that is going to have a profound impact on African American women candidates going forward. And so what Black women have been able to demonstrate is that they have the kinds of independent networks that are important, that because they have the capacity to do all the things that a successful candidate needs, right? So they have the capacity to identify and train talented candidates. And so now organizations related to the African American community, and specifically those working with African American women, are actively trying to figure out what is needed to identify and train talented candidates going forward. They also are able to identify open and vulnerable seats and start recruiting Black women candidates who might run for those offices. They are now able also to staff campaigns at every single level. There is no part of an election electoral campaign that African American women cannot serve in a particular position. They do campaign polling and research. They write speeches. They're spokespeople. They do all the things that a campaign needs, and that just puts African American women in more of the discussions about the future of politics and the future of political parties. And the last thing that 2020 showed us is that African American women are more than willing to fund candidates, particularly in the early days. And so if you look at the work of organizations like the Black sororities, especially Kamala Harris's sorority, which is AKA, if you look at things like the Links, all these organizations that many white Americans don't even understand exist, really came to bear and raised more money politically than they had ever raised in the past. And it demonstrates I think a level of maturity and opportunity for African American women candidates. And it also, I think, tells us that the future for African American women running for office is only starting to begin. And ultimately what we'll see is more and more African American women contending for political office. And when you see more and more of them contending for political office, some of them will break through. And that is the ultimate goal for people like me who is interested in seeing more Black women hold elective office. That's it for me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see your faces. Yes, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see your faces. I felt like I went through that really fast. I know it's 1 o'clock there, but it's like 3 o'clock in the afternoon here. So I know this is the end of my day. So if I went through things really fast and you want me to go back and explain something, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, if you have any questions, I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have or comments.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Price. That was fantastic. And students and everyone in attendance, you are welcome to type questions in the chat. Oh, we have actually a comment in the chat from Phoenix, who is a student in my women's history class. So glad that.
Should I manage the hands, or are you going to do that, Diana, before I move forward?
I think Eva Rhodes was going to monitor the hands.
That's great.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was not able to unmute myself.
No worries.
I wanted to thank you very much, Dr. Price. We very much appreciate your presentation. I was going to say we have about 15 minutes or so for questions, and so the attendees can either unmute themselves, or if you prefer, you can write your question in the chat. I was actually presented with the first question to you, and then we'll get to the other ones. So the question is, Shirley Chisholm said, "I want to be remembered as a woman who dared to be a catalyst for change."
Right.
So what guidance or strategies would you offer to help young adults think about being a catalyst for change? Thank you.
One of the things that I always tell young people is that politics, any of it, any part of it, public speaking, challenging people who are in authority, thinking about sort of making policies, researching laws, all of those things are things you learn. If you learn them early enough, it gets you through your life, and especially through your political life well. And so politics is a muscle that you use. It's not a thing that sort of pops up one day. Young people who are running for office, who want to run for office eventually, understand this better than most. And so the thing is to look around on your campus, to look around in your community, and look at organizations that are doing the work that you think is important, and then going to volunteer in those organizations, going to work in those organizations, to try to learn more about, first of all, how the political system works, and then try to learn more about what kinds of ways you can contribute to it, right? I think sometimes I am often saddened when I see my students so disappointed in some political outcome, when I know for sure that if they knew more about how politics worked, they would have known that this was going to be the outcome, right? And so sometimes when you say, oh no, that thing isn't gonna work, they think it's because you're not hopeful, but sometimes it's because I understand how the Constitution is set up, right? And so it's like also learning like civic stuff. I think all of those things are important, but nothing is more important than doing it. Nothing is more important than getting involved with an organization, working on a campaign. Nothing is more important than those things, right? Because that's where you learn how to do the process of governing. And we need more and more and more young people to do that. I don't even know, that's enough of that. Just do it. Start volunteering for some stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we have a question from Judy Mays. Yes. Can you say a little bit about Dorothy Height and her work with the civil rights movement?
Well, Dorothy Heights is a god in civil rights work. You know what I mean? Like understanding all the ways that Dorothy Height brought together African-American women, but not just African-American women, but forming coalitions with other women's organizations to help fund civil rights efforts, to really, until she died, which wasn't that long ago, to always be a person who was vocal about how these things impact African-American women. And so, for instance, one of the things that happens when they start to, during every presidential inauguration, most people don't notice this because they don't care, but one of the things that always happens on the car parade of things that happens in the presidential inauguration is, one of the things is, for the last few cycles, they drive past the National Council of Negro Women headquarters. Why do they do that? Because it is a nod, especially on the part of people from the Democratic Party, that African-American women play a key role in the process of them being there. That said, Johnetta Cole has taken over overrunning the National Council of Negro Women, it is still a place and still a voice that does a lot of work, much of it behind the scenes, sort of organizing that people don't pay enough attention to. But I think there are also organizations that are emerging right now of Black women who are political, who are doing lots of things in the same vein as Dorothy Height, but certainly she is the model.
And Judy, did you have an addition to your question? Oh, if not, we'll move on. Next question is from Dr. Crumpton. Dr. Price, how do you explain the importance of Black women in politics to your students?
Well, here's the thing that is interesting about Black women is that they fall short or they end up on the terrible side of so many policies, right? When you look at healthcare, when you look at infant mortality rates, if you look at a wealth accumulation, if you look at all the things that should predict whether or not you're going to be an active political participant, African American women also are almost always on the low end of those demographics. They have the most college debt. They have the least. They have the least wealth. They have, it's like when you look at them, they are not the people who you would think were the #1 voting demographic in several election cycles. So you think about 2008, 2012, African American women are outvoting everybody, not just Black men, not just other people of color, but they are also outvoting white men. And so they are performing well beyond what any of the indicators would suggest. And that's also true of African American youth and young African American women. And part of the thing I think that people would want to do is to try to understand why. I teach at my alma mater now, which is Prairie View A&M University. It is a historically Black college in Texas. And we have been in ongoing protest and litigation as college students with the local elected officials in that county since the 1970s. And so what you see is young students who come ready, who are ingrained from the day that they get on that campus, that one of the things that we're not going to do is we're not going to have our participation diminished by the people in the county. So when people are looking, and almost all of that, as you can imagine, is led by young African American women. And so when people ask questions like, why can't we get youth involved? When people ask questions like, why can't we get more poor people involved? When people ask questions about why we can't get, people who live in low income neighborhoods involved, the answer is right there with Black women. You just need to talk to them and ask them why they do it. And part of the reason they're doing it is because they have a very strong collective outlook, and they know that they are participating not just for themselves, but also for children in their community. They are participating for people who have been disenfranchised through felon disenfranchisement. And they see this as a collective work that leads to hopefully a collective outcome.
Okay, and Dr. Price, there is a request. Please talk about the Black colleges and churches' role in politics.
I'm a graduate of the University of Black College, and I now teach at that same historic Black college. And it's coming home. And one of the things.
All right, something's going on with your audio. No.
The microphone. Do you have an earpiece? Do you have
Let me see if I can figure out how to get one to work. You can't hear me at all.
We can hear you, but it's very echoey and.
That's very jumbled and kind of, or garbled.
Because I have earpieces, but they're not, I don't know them very well on this computer. One thing that I'm going to do is if you could send me like a phone number, I can call in for sound.
Okay, I'll go ahead and do that. I'll email or I'll send you the phone number.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. It was fine, and then all of a sudden something just switched over.
There was a suggestion to maybe cut the video, maybe turn off your video and see if that might help. I don't know.
Dr. Price, if you are using, are you using Bluetooth earphones? There is either a latency issue with your internet that might be coinciding with this, or do you have another microphone on your system that you can go to?
I don't.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
Okay, great.
yay.
Good.
Okay. So the request was to talk about the Black colleges and churches' role in politics.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
No sound now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. I'm very sorry about this. I don't know what's happening. It's
All right.
the world we live in now. I was going to say I love talking about historically Black colleges. I'm a graduate of a historically Black college, which makes them of great interest to me, and the idea of their survival is really important. African American leaders are often incubated at historically Black colleges, and that's not just in the past, but we have come to look at it once again because of people like Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams and Raphael Warnock. And to the extent that Donald Trump will be held accountable in any courts, it might come through Georgia, where there's a graduate of a historically Black college is a district attorney, or through New York, where a graduate of a historically Black college is the state attorney. And so one of the things that we know for sure is that African-American colleges are the thing that still continues to incubate Black leadership. But even if you don't care about that part, one of the things that I know in my state, and I know it happens a lot in other states, is that African Americans, if you want to look at engineers, teachers, nurses, doctors, the vast majority of them somehow spent time at historically Black colleges, right? So if you want to go to medical, if you're Black and you want your child to go to medical school, one of the things you could do is send them to a historically Black college. They're very good at it. If you're interested in sort of STEM things. And so it is important for us all to think more clearly and more cleverly, I think, about our relationships with historically Black colleges. And I would, by the way, throw in there, because I'm in Texas, also Hispanic serving institutions and tribal colleges, right? Thinking about the ways that what they do for those communities with a fraction of the resources of many colleges that are also state funded, because we're state funded, what they do with those resources and how they turn out students who are able to not only increase their own lifetime and financial trajectory, but also that of their families. So I teach at a college that is not that different, probably, I would imagine, from where you are. You know, we have 70% of our kids are Pell Grant eligible. About that same amount are also first-generation college students. And so we really are taking African-American students who largely have been failed by the K through 12 process and getting them trained and ready to be excellent in professions. And I'll stop there because, you know, I could talk all day about it. And about churches, by the way, which one of the things that we should, if you're interested in churches, I will say, is the thing that Black churches, I think, should be concerned about is the way in which they don't have as profound, or they're not as central to the kinds of grassroots movements that are existing today. It doesn't mean that there aren't specific pastors, there aren't specific religious people who are tied into these movements, but the church itself as sort of a central place of meeting and gathering around political issues is something that has diminished greatly. And I think the church should be concerned about that, and they should figure out how they're going to move into those spaces, not necessarily how those young people are going to get back into those spaces. Anything else? I saw somebody ask a question about the food trucks.
Sorry, Dr. Price, I was having trouble unmuting myself again. Yeah, There is a comment from Phoenix
Yes.
who said, I was shocked to learn that they are trying to make it illegal to bring food to the voters in line.
So if you look starting really at 2008, nearly every new rule about voting in almost any state has been to suppress votes. Very few of them have been to expand voter access, particularly if you look at the South. And after the 2013 Shelby v. Holder decision, which essentially killed most of the most important things of the Voting Rights Act, though states were ready with legislation in hand to figure out how to prevent people from voting. And so, you know, you have things like you have to have a state-funded ID, which costs money. And in places like Houston, the place where you get the ID is all on the outskirts of the city. And Houston is huge. And so if you have to go to the suburbs to find this in a place where you don't have quality public transportation, then it actually makes the process more onerous. But also because we have all seen the pictures of African Americans who are standing in lines that are going around the block trying to figure out how to get there, we know that one of the things that people need is food and water. And so organizations are at the ready to send food trucks to places where there are long lines. There are people who are ready there to give them water to encourage them to not get out of line. And legislators who have seen this have decided that it is something that is unreasonable. Rather than trying to figure out how we shorten the lines, how we make sure that African Americans, Latinos, and other groups have enough machines to account for the lines, rather than doing that, what they're trying to do is punish the people who are trying to make it bearable for people to stand in those lines. But it's also things like not opening polls on Sundays anymore because they know that African Americans have a thing called Souls to the Polls, where people take buses literally from churches straight to polling locations so they can early vote. It also means cutting out early voting. Why? Because Barack Obama killed his Republican opponents with early voting, because Black people vote early. And so there are all these ways that they are trying to figure out how to manipulate the process so that it's so difficult to participate that African Americans won't. The thing that they have a hard time calculating, however, is that African Americans are actually very well motivated by racism. It's a sad thing to say, but you do something racist to somebody they like, it motivates them. They get active. They start figuring out how they're going to do something. I mean, I like to tell the story all the time of my mom, who in 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, if she saw something that happened to him that she thought was racist, she would just donate $25 more. It has the exact opposite effect, right? And so you have increased turnout from the general election to the special election in Georgia. You have more people registering to vote. You have more people coming out because African Americans know what it's like to fight racism. They're good at it. And so you actually motivate them in a weird way. I'm saying I don't want that kind of motivation. I'm saying it doesn't have necessarily have the same impact. But also because we know for sure that if it were not for voter suppression, Stacey Abrams would be governor of Georgia, and she would have been overseeing the 2020 election, right? We know Beto O'Rourke would be senator from Texas, were it not for voter suppression. We know that this is the thing that's really key. Think about the people who were large voices in the January 6th Capitol takeover, the politicians who were involved. Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, all three of them would not be in office at all if there wasn't for voter suppression. Because Jamie Harrison came very close to beating Lindsey Graham. Beto O'Rourke came very close to beating Ted Cruz. Marco Rubio barely won. And one of the things he's afraid of is that Ivanka Trump is going to run against him because he knows he's in a precarious position. And all of those things, they were able to do all of those things because voter suppression was able to keep them in office. And that is the thing that we need to think more about.
There is another comment from Malachi Best. I just wanted to say that Dr. Price, your presentation was very influential to hear, and it's getting me fired up to see Black women entrepreneurship and politics. Thank you so much.
Yeah, they're working together and they're figuring out how to get this done. I have to say that the level of support. So it's interesting that, you know, I'm sure all of y'all have your thoughts about Kamala Harris out there, but it's interesting to think that one of the things about Kamala Harris that Black women understood immediately about her importance is that it wasn't just about her personally. It's about if you allow people to engage in certain kinds of race, gender attacks, it is a problem for all Black women. It is a problem for Black women in the boardroom. It's a problem for Black women in the classroom. It's a problem for Black women, you know, on the police force. It's a problem for Black women everywhere. And so they took great care to make sure to defend against those kinds of specialized sounds positive, but those kinds of assaults that are particularly aimed at African-American women, about being man-hating, about being unqualified, about talking too much, about being too aggressive, about all the things that we say about Black women and girls, because they understood that beyond Kamala Harris, if this plays out on the national level, we as individuals are not immune from that process. And so when my students start saying, well, you know, I never really cared for Kamala Harris, I was like, I don't care. I care for Black women and how they're treated in society. So I don't care what you think about her. What you cannot do is join into forces who are engaged in sort of racialized, gendered particularities about how we treat Black women in this society.
Thank you. Next question is from Dr. Teresa Aldrich. Donna Brazile had the courage to expose the National Democratic Party. Do you believe they recovered from that exposure, or is there still more work to do?
Do I believe that she recovered or we recovered?
Do they believe that the National Democratic Party has recovered from that exposure, or is there still work to do?
Yeah, you know, I have a love-hate relationship with the Democratic Party. I mean, I know it's where we are going to be. There's no doubt. There's no real impetus on the part of the Republican Party at this moment to at least pretend as if they want to welcome Black people into their party, because you cannot welcome most Black people into your party if you also embrace the Proud Boys and organizations like that. You can't be a white nationalist and welcome Black people at the same time. It's very impossible. I was going to say very difficult, but it's impossible. And so that means that the Democratic Party really is the place where we have to make our stand. And that creates a kind of relationship where the party knows that we're not going anywhere. And when you know that a person ain't leaving, you don't treat them the same as people who have options, right? I mean, I try to explain this to my students all the time. It's like, you know, literally I told my class yesterday, it's like when you were 9 years old and you were like, I'm running away from home. I'm gonna go live somewhere else. And your parent or custodial person said, where you gonna go? And you know you have nowhere to go, and they know you have nowhere to go. So they're not gonna bend because they know you can't go anywhere. African Americans exist in many ways in that space for Democrats. But here's the thing that African Americans can do. They cannot turn out. And without high levels of African American turnout, Democrats will not win. They won't. Because they need African Americans in these huge states to show up at levels beyond things that even make sense given their population in order for them to hold on to victories. And that is why they're having to pay more attention to Black voters now, not because they know they can go somewhere else, but they know they can stay home. And Black people staying home is dangerous for Democratic candidates.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going back a little bit. Dr. Tanika Bird had put into the chat, Black Women of Political Action has a Sacramento chapter. We're always looking for Black women to join and learn about how we can insert ourselves into the political conversation. And then she added the link and said, please let her know if there are any questions.
Sure. I mean, there are organizations all over the country who are engaged in this. So you don't have to just focus on national elections. One of the best places to cut your teeth if you're really interested in elections and campaigning is on like school board elections, because they can't afford to hire a lot of people. And so you'll find yourself as a college student doing all kinds of things that you never would have thought. You'll be a campaign spokesman. You'll be a fundraiser. You'll be going door to door. Like, you'll do all the things. And that means that you actually sort of get a kind of experience that you wouldn't on national campaigns. But more than that, here's the thing that is unique about this moment that I think all of you should be paying attention to. Stacey Abrams and her organization, Inse Ufot and New Georgia Project, Luce in Arizona, those organizations aren't Democrat. They don't belong to the Democratic Party. They're independent of the Democratic Party, which means they did the Democratic Party a solid. And they were like, we're going to let you get in the office because we want this other guy out. But that doesn't mean that they will always do that. That doesn't mean that they won't turn around and protest Joe Biden. And so there's a way in which people of color have had more independence in terms of in their political life than they've had probably since the 1960s, because you now have these grassroots independent organizations like Black Votes Matter and organizations like that who work with the Democratic Party, but they don't have to, who supported the Biden-Harris ticket, but they didn't have to. And as long as they stay independent, as long as they're not sort of caught up in the Democratic machine, then they can always threaten to pull their support whenever they want. And that threat is the thing that makes people listen to them. And so it's a really sort of sweet spot for people of color in the Democratic Party right now. HR 1 will be voted into law. Look, I think that the Democrats, they're getting ready to pass. They're going to pass a lot of stuff. We don't have to worry about the House at all. They are just going to be voting full time. The question is what's going to happen in the Senate, right? We know that if Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema don't play ball, then we won't ever get to Kamala Harris passing the tie vote. And so the Democratic Party is going to have to figure out what they're going to do with Manchin and Sinema. If it was me, I would start stripping them of their committee assignments. I would start stripping them of all the power they have in Congress. If you're not on our team, get off of it. And then see what they do. Well, not me, and I'm not a Democrat. So what the Democrats are going to do is just sort of bow to whatever this dude wants, just until the midterm election to see whether or not they can gain some more seats. So yes, I think it'll be passed. Whether or not it'll get voted on and whether or not it'll make it through the Senate, I don't know.
I think, I'm not sure if we have time for one more question from Evelyn Silva. What do you feel is the long-term effect of the adultification of young Black girls perpetuated in school and society?
Right. There's this thing that I started paying attention to, particularly around the death of Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice. And it's not just sort of the adultification that, we talk a lot about how in Black families, we make Black girls be more accountable, be more responsible, take on more and more things than we do Black boys. That's part of it. Part of it also is that the age of Black people is generally misperceived. And in fact, people often add age to Black children. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you have a 7-year-old Black girl and people look at her and they're like, she's 10. Or you have a 12-year-old Black boy and you look at him and you think he's 18. But the problem is now you're dealing with a 7-year-old in the same way you would deal with a 10-year-old. And you're dealing with a 12-year-old in the same way you would deal with an 18-year-old. And that leads to all kinds of problems, right? And so what we really need to think more about is helping people sort of translate Black childhood cross-racially, to translate Black youth culture cross-racially, and not just hip hop, right? What it is about Black people and how they behave, about Black youth culture and how they behave, and why is it that we cannot see girls as girls? Why is it we cannot see boys as boys? And so until we are able to deal with that, then it's going to be very difficult to think about how we're going to change what happens to them in society. And so we know that Black girls tend to be expelled and excluded from school at very high levels, extremely high levels. part of that is about the ways in which people talk about them as being too sassy, too adult, too loud, too grown, too all of these things. And so it's important, I think, for all of us to think through the ways in which we look at Black children and try to think about them as being older than they are, and try to make them be older than they are, and make assumptions about how old they are. And so if you're in the mall and if you see 3 young Black teenagers and you see trouble and not children, then the way you're going to react to them, the way you're going to deal with them is completely different, right? And so that means that 13-year-old, 12-year-old Black children are also being stopped by the cops, are also being harassed by the police, are also, that cop, Mike Brown and that cop, they had come in contact before. You know what I mean? Like, these are things that happen because of the ways that we try to think of and we misperceive Black children as being older than they actually are. And we have to be very careful about that within our own community, and particularly outside of our community for people who have power over our children. That is teachers, people in truancy offices, vice principals, people like that, to also think of them as children.
Thank you, Dr. Price. I think we're going to move now to Dr. Williams.
I'm sorry, should I answer that last question about Black and Brown solidarity or not? Hello?
I think
Yes, please go ahead and answer it. Yes.
Okay. You know, I recently moved back to Texas after having lived in the Northeast for a very long time. I was born and raised in Texas, so the idea of Black Brown solidarity is super important to me. I think that there is a chance always that Black and Brown people in places like Texas and California will be pitted against each other, but mostly so white people can keep the spoils keep the profits, keep the benefits, keep the things in office. And we see it rearing its ugly head a lot when it comes to political appointments, when it comes to these kinds of things, when in fact we have a natural need to be allies with each other, right? I come from a state that had a tripartite, a 3-part system of segregation where Mexican Americans and other Latinos were also segregated, also sent to their own schools, also lynched, also disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. And if we can think about how we can come together to do this, I think we have a chance at being more successful. And interestingly, Stacey Abrams and the New Georgia Project, they have explicit organizing for Latinx communities in Georgia, for Asian American communities in Georgia. And so they took seriously the fact that people of color share things in common that we need to get done as a way of organizing. And as long as you're organizing people in that fashion, then you have a chance for success. But the minute we turn it into competition, then ultimately both groups have lost. And then those whites who are in power get to stay in power. That's it.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Consumers River College, I want to would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for participating and sharing in today's celebration of Women's History Month. I also want to thank the conveners of this inspiring and empowering event, especially the members of the Women's History and Black History Month committees, for their shared commitment to centering and amplifying the voices and experiences of women whose stories have been silenced and activism has been rendered invisible or forgotten. Finally, we'd like to thank our keynote speaker, Dr. Melanie Price, for sharing her insight and expertise on the ways in which the political labor of Black women, historically and in contemporary terms, is integral to the story of building an American democratic project, compelling new conversations about women of color in politics and history, and really complicating democratic politics and disrupting norms that either center race or gender, but not race and gender. As our colleague Wendy Smooth would say, it's a mess worth making. And finally, these stories shared by Dr. Price really highlight for all of us the trajectory of democracy in America, a trajectory that is bent towards inclusivity, a more egalitarian system, and a system which is just. So I want to thank all of you today for participating, and please continue to join us for the rest of our Women's History Month events. Thank you so much.